I'm going to open with this quote, which is one of my favorite quotes ever. Nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in the images inside our heads. And for anyone who's read Borderlands, Gloria Anzaldua, it's an amazing book. And I'm putting this up here because I just want this emphasis between on the connection between images and material reality, just kind of like hang out in the room while I talk here. So I'm going to spend the time we have together today thinking with you about the relationship between absence, abandonment, and gentrification. Although after what Rob said last night, I'm going to actually probably end up calling it displacement, dispossession. You know, there are so many words that we throw around. What is really at the core, I think, dispossession. But sometimes I use gentrification because those are the words that folks on the ground use, and I think it's important to keep that language even as we can develop more specific terms as well. So I want to suggest that these three terms are really intimately connected, and that the most effective resistance to their bad shit involves a kind of reorientation of the relationships that we have to land and housing. And for us to get to that reorientation, we create images and reimaginings inside our heads, which lead to material changes on the ground. And to talk about this, I'm going to share how one particular group of homeless activists, which you've already heard the name of a couple times, Picture the Homeless, which Rob was a member of in New York City, how they understand this relationship between these three forces and how they have formulated their resistance to this vortex of ugly urban forces. So this is going to be interactive for a second, wake everyone up. So I'm going to show you three pictures, and I just want you to start by shouting out first, what do you see? Just a little louder, I can't hear you. Fence, okay. Vacant lot, someone said. Yeah. Abandonment, vacant lots, emptiness. Opportunity, okay, that's perfect. So what kind of opportunity? What do you imagine existing here?
Community garden.
Community garden? Okay.
Starbucks.
Starbucks. There we go. Yeah.
Upscale condo.
Upscale condo, right. So, yeah, so these three pictures are all vacant lots in New York City. And all of the things that everyone just shouted out, I think, are things that we can commonly imagine based both on, like, unfortunate experience, like the Starbucks and the luxury housing, and, you know, on experience that comes out of resistance, right? Community gardens and these sorts of things that resist the financialization of vacant lots in cities. So what I want to do, we're going to come back to the vacant lots in a minute, but I want to kind of go through these three words that I've thrown out here: abandonment, gentrification, and absence, because I think it's just important to show you how I'm coming at them. So abandonment, I think of as kind of the primary visual result of disinvestment. And, you know, there's a long history of disinvestment in urban areas, primarily urban areas that have been racialized as non-white in the United States. And I think that these pictures of abandonment are kind of the way we've come to understand them. There's some really famous images, which I didn't put up there, of abandoned buildings in the Bronx in the 1970s. Detroit, right? We can all think of Detroit and the narrative that's been spun around that space over the last years. Geographers have kind of thought of abandonment in terms of passive abandonment, which Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Craig Gilmore recently wrote about as kind of this space where you don't necessarily see abandonment as something that's violently happening in cities, but is kind of the cumulative result of years and years of policies, not just the initial disinvestment that occurred in the 1960s and 1970s, but kind of the pile-on of policies which may have even been put in place to address disinvestment, but still lead to abandonment. We can think about welfare reform, right, as one of the biggest examples of that. On the other hand, the Wallaces in 1998 talked about aggressive abandonment as this very strict withdrawal of services, right? And the biggest example that they give of that is the cutting of fire services in certain parts of New York City in the 1970s, particularly the South Bronx. This idea of planned shrinkage, which was big in the urban planning jargon of the late 70s, that, you know, this neighborhood's kind of beyond what we can do, and so we're just going to let it return to the land, was one of the phrases they used. This resurfaced in Detroit again about 10 years ago. So that's kind of the background on abandonment. So gentrification, displacement, you know, there's a couple really important ideas about this. Accumulation by dispossession, David Harvey talking about how, you know, wealth is gained through people's dispossession, and there's, you know, a lot of really clear links as to how that happens, which I don't want to get into the weeds here. There's an important accompanying process to that, which is Neil Smith's theory of revanchism, which has particular resonance for homelessness because he argued that the city is essentially taking revenge, French, on homeless populations as being visual obstacles to prosperity, to gentrification, to the expansion of private capital. Or another way to think about it, a quote from Picture the Homeless member in one of the surveys that we've been doing over the last couple of years. The people moving in around here don't want to see you anymore. And this is something that was said by a police officer in the neighborhood of East Harlem, which is one of the gentrifying neighborhoods in Upper Manhattan. And this homeless person was being told, you need to move. He was standing in front of the Harlem train station at 125th and Park Avenue, and he said, why? And this is what he was told, right? So we can see this playing out in all sorts of really nasty ways. And then absence, which I think is a little less clear, and this is something that I want to keep expanding on, but sometimes we have to look at not just what is present in the picture, and think back to the vacant lots, right? You know, weeds, fences, these sorts of things, but what's not there? And folks in this room actually started getting to that when we asked, you know, what can you imagine being here, right? Starbucks, or housing, or a community garden. None of those things are actually there in the image. And similarly, I think in images around homelessness that circulate kind of in the moral economy of images, if you will, there's, you know, we see homelessness, we see folks with lots of baggage with them, we see all of the, you know, bad shit that happens when you live on the streets, but we often don't see in the images the absence of a home and the absence of affordable housing. And so this is one of the connections that Picture the Homeless is making in their work that I'm kind of trying to trace. I think Gil Hochberg, who's a scholar at USC, I believe, makes a really interesting argument about looking for absence as a counter-visual practice. You know, there are lots of ways in which visuality can be really punitive, right? And we can think about like the surveillance state and what some scholars will call like ocular centrism, this real determination to just like rely on vision as the primary sense for knowing, and in particular knowing the city. And so sometimes looking at what is invisible and thinking about why that matters, I think can be a really powerful counter-visual practice. So that's all kind of the academic background, but the real question here is how does Picture the Homeless resist, and how do they think about these layers of displacement through these vacant lots that I showed at the beginning? So as everyone in this room is probably aware, homeless folks are often kind of the first people to feel the brunt of dispossession, and they can actually end up feeling it in multiple spaces. So I think someone earlier, Tony was speaking about this, how, you know, you can get forced out of one neighborhood. This happens a lot in New York between Harlem and the Bronx, right? Longtime residents of Harlem will be forced out, they'll become homeless. Harlem gentrified previously about 20 years ago. They'll end up in the South Bronx. You know, they'll get into affordable housing, no longer homeless. And now the South Bronx is gentrifying, and who are the first people out, you know? So I think because of this, PTH members begin to see a deeper need beyond just resisting displacement. They've started to make these historical connections between disinvestment and abandonment and speculation. And they see what lies beneath, which, as Rob alluded to earlier, is land, right? That's kind of the common denominator in all of these struggles. And so what I'm going to do now is talk about how Picture the Homeless kind of formulated their resistance to the problem of vacancy and homelessness. So first there was a political economic analysis. So this picture is from a report called Banking on Vacancy, which Picture the Homeless made about 6 years ago now, probably. It's a really powerful report. It's actually taught as required reading in Columbia's urban planning program. It's a really interesting piece of literature, and basically what they did is that the city did not keep track of how many vacant buildings or vacant lots there were, and so PTH did it themselves. They fanned out all over the city. They learned from folks at the CUNY Graduate Center how to do participatory action research. I'll just run off some of the numbers real fast. Basically, they found that there were over 3,500 vacant buildings and about 2,500 vacant lots across the city. And doing the math, they found that the buildings could house 71,000 people, the lots could house over 128,000 people. Total, almost 200,000 people could be housed in these vacant spaces. Right now, New York has about 65,000 homeless folks, maybe even higher than that, but definitely not 200,000. So the whole point of the report is basically proving that there's more than enough vacant land and buildings in New York City to house all the homeless people in not only just the city, but even in the greater tri-state area. So, the question they then asked is like, okay, so who's profiting, right? Who's profiting from keeping these lots vacant? Because clearly no one's doing this just for shits and giggles, right? There's an economic motive going on. And they went into all the, there's a long history, which I probably don't have time to get into here, but, New York City was once upon a time the second largest landlord in the country behind only the New York City Public Housing Authority. When the abandonment and disinvestment that we talked about kind of hit its peak in the late 70s, New York City owned a huge amount of vacant land, a huge amount of deteriorating buildings, and became known as in-rem housing. And the city was basically like treating it like a hot potato, right? They didn't want to become a landlord. They didn't know what to do with it, and so they just started giving it away. First to nonprofit developers, which was encouraged heavily by the Carter administration, and then as that land became valuable, they started offloading it on private developers for pennies on the dollar. And so then we kind of see this cycle and how it gets started. So in addition to that economic analysis, Picture the Homeless has the political ecological analysis, which I think is really interesting because this is not a connection that's often made in homelessness studies, right? So Jose Rodriguez, one of our members, says the city counts trees, but it doesn't have a clue how many vacant buildings there are. And of course part of that is like, what does the city value more, right? A tree or a human being? But there's also this question of what kind of land is valued, right? So this is one way of getting at that the city pursues ecological projects over human projects. And we have to question, and PTH questions constantly, the kind of ecological value that's become dominant. I think the Highline Park in New York, the Hudson Yards project, which I see a poster up about on the wall here, these are development projects that the city is primarily framing in their ecological value. On the other hand, a lot of Picture the Homeless members live in parks across the city, right? And so again, this questioning this fundamental relationship to land has become really central to PTH's analysis of the economic problem of vacant lots and vacant buildings. So where all this leads is community land trusts. And I'm not sure how familiar folks are with the concept of community land trust, but the basic way that I like to explain it is that you separate land from housing, right? And so the community controls the land. I mean, in New York City, there's actually 3 layers. There's land, building, air rights, but we're going to leave air rights out of the equation right now because that's a whole other story. But you separate the land and the building, you create a community board, the community board controls the land, different people control the building. So you can have, a landlord come in and run a building, but if the landlord doesn't own the land, he does not have a lot of say over the value of his building, and therefore he has no justification to increase rents. So Picture the Homeless had to go through this very long process of explaining community land trusts in far more depth than I just did, not only to their members, but also to policymakers. And this, I think, gets into an interesting conversation about, talking to elites, which we talked about last night. And I'm going to run out of time, so maybe we'll get into that another time. But I just want to kind of wind up by saying that all of this to me is about resisting this disastrous cycle of abandonment to dispossession, which really just traffics and stops in homelessness and housing insecurity. And by doing so, PTH is also dealing with this visual question of absence and presence, and I think that's a really central part of their work. It's even in their name, Picture the Homeless, and I don't think we should forget that. I think that's really important. So when Picture the Homeless looked at these vacant lots, they saw not only future opportunities for speculative development, or even just this vision of like, we need more affordable housing, which a lot of people say, but they saw this different relationship between land and property. And I think that's super crucial. I think that's something that we have to hold on to through these different housing movements. And I think it's this position kind of as homeless folks in New York who have really received the brunt of the stigmatization associated with broken windows policing primarily over the years, that brings PTH to resist dispossession through these visually imaginative ways by understanding that the images change before the ground that we stand on does. So, thank you.